In 1998, a diver picked up a strange sonar blip next to the wreck of the Titanic. This blip bugged scientists for over 20 years. The sonar system was clearly showing some huge object was hiding next to the most famous shipwreck in history. The scientists couldn't decide if it was coming from another shipwreck, some sort of a geological feature, or something else they didn't even expect to find there. The mystery was finally solved only in 2022. Paul Henry Nargeolet, the diver who first discovered the blip, teamed up with other researchers and went on a new expedition. They found a whole deep-sea reef made up of various volcanic formations and packed with marine life 9,514 feet under the surface. It turned out the reef was the source of the mysterious blip the sonar had detected. They found sponges, corals, fish, lobsters, and other creatures on top of the basalt ridge. The team made a lot of pictures, videos, and took water samples to study later. They're using computer models to figure out how all the animals and plants found there survive in the deep sea. This can help scientists solve the old mystery of how sponges and corals can spread out across the ocean. These creatures need something solid to hold on to as they grow and multiply. But they also survive in muddy places where it's hard to find these solid surfaces. And it's important for scientists to understand what helps them do it. All of this research is part of a bigger project to see how fragile underwater worlds might change or survive in the future. There's another mystery near the Titanic that Nargeolet wants to explore in the future. He noticed another blip between the Titanic and a newly discovered reef a long time ago. Nargeolet thinks this new mystery object might be even bigger than the reef. The Titanic is lying on the ocean floor in two big pieces pointing in different directions. After it had sunk, the boilers, which show where it went down, were found about 600 feet east of the back end of the ship. The bow of the Titanic remained intact when it hit the seabed, but the stern was completely mangled because of the implosions it went through during the descent. The air trapped within the structure just couldn't handle the increasing pressure of the water deep down. Some people who survived the famous shipwreck mentioned that they had seen the ship break in half as it was sinking. At first, no one believed them. But now we know that the Titanic really did split apart between its second and third funnels as it was going down into the water. It took the most famous ship in history 2 hours and 40 minutes to submerge completely. The collision let water flood 6 out of 16 watertight compartments. As the water gushed into the starboard side, the ship started to tilt down in the front and a bit to the right. By midnight, the damaged compartments were spilling water into others. Water started flooding through anchor chain holes, and by 2 a.m., the bow was sinking and the stern's propellers were lifted out of the water. The ship kept flooding until the moment the bow went under the water and the stern went up at a steep angle of almost 45 degrees. The weight of those massive propellers stressed the ship's midsection. The steel just couldn't handle it and failed. Survivors described that moment as some loud noise, like breaking china. That was the Titanic's upper structure giving in. By 12 past 2 a.m., the bow and stern were only connected by the inner bottom structure. Minutes later, the bow, weighing around 16,000 tons, broke loose from the stern. The stern rose sharply to an almost vertical position and started sinking slowly. By 2:20, it disappeared underwater. During the descent, the big funnels were torn off, dragging along cables and other parts of the ship's deck. The ship's front mast also broke and fell, smashing onto the bridge area. The wheelhouse where the captain steered the ship was probably destroyed when the mast came crashing down. The bow was cruising down at about 23 miles per hour and had hit the ocean floor almost half an hour before the stern. The hit was so hard that it bent and broke parts of the ship even more. The decks at the back of the bow collapsed on top of each other. The area around the bridge where the ship was controlled looks especially damaged, almost like a giant fist had squashed it. The roof and sides of the officers' quarters and the gym were pushed in, and railings were bent outwards. Some experts think that when the bow suddenly stopped sinking, a powerful blast of water caused by the sudden halt smashed down onto the wreck. It caused even more damage, but you can't see the damage from when the Titanic hit the iceberg anymore because it's buried under the mud. If you want to go check it out yourself, you must know that the waters around the Titanic are still really, really dangerous. First off, the icebergs are still wild in the area. In 2019, a total of 1,515 icebergs floated far enough south to get into the paths where ships travel across the Atlantic Ocean between March and August. Second, sunlight can only reach about 3,300 feet below the surface, and beyond that, it's completely dark. The area where the Titanic lies is called the Midnight Zone because there's no light at all. When scientists go down to explore the Titanic, they spend over 2 hours descending through pitch-black water before the ocean floor suddenly appears under the lights of their submersible. Seeing anything down there is tough because the submersible's lights only light up a few feet ahead, so it's easy to get lost. To help find their way, explorers use detailed maps of the Titanic wreck site, built over many years, and special tools like accelerometers and gyroscopes to track the ship's position and orientation. Even with all this technology, it's still really hard to find your way down there. Plus, the deeper you go in the ocean, the more pressure there is from the water all around. At the bottom of the ocean where the Titanic rests, the pressure is about 390 times higher than what we feel at the surface. Because of this, subs need to have really thick walls to survive these extreme conditions and keep the people inside safe. The currents down there aren't as powerful as on the surface, but sometimes so-called benthic storms can create powerful underwater currents that can sweep things away from the ocean floor. The Titanic is affected by them. The currents near it mostly flow from east to west and from northwest to southwest, but they can change direction a lot, especially around the bow section of the wreck. Many experts think that over time, these currents will move enough sand and mud to cover the Titanic wreck with layers of sediment. After more than 100 years underwater, the Titanic slowly started to break down. Tiny microbes have been eating away the metal over the years. This created rusty icicle-like formations called rusticles. These rusticles are making the ship fall apart even faster, especially on the back part. Scientists believe this wreck is breaking down 40 years faster than the front. The wreck is slowly collapsing bit by bit every year, but as long as no one touches or goes inside it, it should stay mostly intact for now. And finally, scientists have found evidence that huge landslides happened around the Titanic wreck long ago. These landslides sent tons of sediment sliding down from the nearby continental slope. They think the last big landslide like this happened tens of thousands of years ago and left layers of sediment up to 328 feet thick. But don't worry, these events are super rare.
The unsinkable Titanic didn't go down peacefully, which made finding its final resting place all the more difficult. The world-famous RMS Titanic sank in 1912, but was only discovered in 1985 on a secret mission. Although people back in the early 1900s had the approximate location of where the Titanic was, they didn't have the right technology to find it. As it went under, the ship sent several CQD signals, standing for Come Quickly, Distress, to a nearby ship named Carpathia. Come at once, we have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man, were some of the final words transmitted from the Marconi wireless on the ship. These Morse code messages were also what made the first research missions to the wreck possible. RMS Carpathia found the lifeboats filled with Titanic survivors, but the world also desperately wanted to see what became of the famous liner. Fast forward to 1953. That's when the first serious attempt to find the Titanic wreck happened. A man named Risdon Beasley tried using a loud eruptive device to locate the ship. It sounds weird, but there's science to back it up. When dynamite goes off, the waves from the detonation hit the bottom of the ocean floor. With the help of sonars, scientists would be able to locate if there was anything solid at the bottom of the ocean. But Beasley had no luck. Another 20 years would pass before oceanographer Robert Ballard would make his attempt to locate the Titanic. Ballard had a bit more luck than Beasley. Over the previous years, underwater technology had gotten more funding and so worked much better. He tried it the first time in 1977. Ballard partnered with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on a mission to map the ocean floor. While the institute hired him to test out their new mapping technology, Ballard's intention was to go a little further and find the Titanic wreck. In the middle of this new technological ship, there was a hole that allowed for a long pipe to be extended into the water just above the ocean floor. Attached to the end of this pipe, Ballard installed a pod with sonars and cameras. They thought they were in for something big, and so they took the ship to sea to run some tests. That's when, on a trial run, adversity struck. The drill pipe broke, sending all of their expensive material to the bottom of the ocean floor, just like the Titanic. When Ballard failed, another important character came into this story, a man named Jack Grimm, an eccentric oil tycoon. Grimm had become famous for trying to find things such as Noah's Ark, the Loch Ness Monster, and Bigfoot. He also tried to prove the hollow Earth theory that says that the interior of Earth is entirely hollow and hosts underground cities and nations. His search consisted of trying to find a large hole on the North Pole and thus venturing inside the hollow Earth. After his attempts failed, he set his eyes on the jewel liner that had sunk, the RMS Titanic. Grimm had the money, but he didn't have the know-how. So, as a billionaire, he made a big donation to Columbia University and asked in return to use some of their equipment. He hired a team of highly qualified scientists to help operate the machinery. Here's where it gets a little strange. Jack Grimm was a believer in folklore and non-conventional ways of doing things. So he brought a monkey on board and surprised the research team. This monkey, called Titan, was believed to point to a map and locate lost things. In this case, the Titanic. The scientists went crazy when the monkey appeared and told Grimm it was either them or the monkey. This expedition left Florida without Titan. Yes, there would be no monkey business. They set the course to the exact location of Titanic's last distress signal. They arrived, examined every inch of the ocean floor, but still found nothing. Grimm's first expedition lasted 3 weeks, but unfortunately, they found absolutely nothing. They tried a particularly good search method known as mowing the lawn, where they mimic such movements to map every inch of a larger area around Titanic's distress coordinates. The reasons for failure were important defects in the equipment and terrible weather. That's when that prior searcher of the lost Titanic came back into the picture, Robert Ballard. He didn't have the millions Jack Grimm had, but he had one thing going for him. The marine geologist was working closely with the U.S. Navy to locate 2 nuclear submarines which had sunk in the 1960s. Ballard himself says he was living 2 lives, one as a researcher and the other as a Navy intelligence officer. The deal was simple. He'd have a green light to search for the Titanic after he found the 2 missing submarines. To find Thresher and Scorpion, he used an unmanned submarine vehicle called Argo. Argo was like a little snow sled. It was attached to a bigger ship that sailed above the water. Argo was connected to the ship by a long cable, and it was piloted by a team on board. The sled had sonars and cameras that provided real-time imaging of the ocean floor, so it was a real advancement on other attempts. After much thinking, he had a eureka moment. He supposed the force of the wreck should have left a comet trail that led back to the ship. While searching for the Titanic, most people had tried to find the ship itself. But until then, it had been trying to find a needle in a haystack. That's why Ballard's logic was so brilliant. He needed to invert the order. He had another obstacle on his hands: time. He could only look for the ship after finding the lost subs. And by the time that happened, he had 12 days left. He teamed up with another scientist, and they applied the mowing the lawn method to map the ocean bed. Another important piece of information that most researchers left out was that there was a sea current moving south on the day of the disaster. This meant that the debris field should be south of the distress signal coordinates. To save time and resources, he would do a quick reconnaissance of the ocean floor, spacing lines more than 3 miles apart to look for debris fields. He also relied more on the camera visuals than on the sonar signals. His team took turns piloting Argo and watching the video. Days rolled by, with nothing but the empty ocean floor showing up. Until the rocks they were used to seeing started to look like man-made debris. Suddenly, there it was, the Titanic's boiler. Ballard was right. The debris field would take them back to the ship. After 73 years of searching, they had finally found the Titanic wreck.
Bet you never heard this story about the Titanic. So, this massive luxury ocean liner was heading out of Southampton on its first voyage to New York with over 2,000 passengers and crew on board. I'll spare you the details for now. You know how it all went down. Since there were a lot of things that went wrong during its short lifespan, some couldn't help but wonder, was it really bad luck? Or was there some mysterious force behind the ruckus? Well, for starters, right as it was leaving the harbor, the Titanic nearly crashed into another ship, called the SS New York. How did that happen? Well, 6 tugboats had to pull the massive Titanic into the river to begin its journey. Captain Smith was in charge, but let's be honest, he probably needed a few more cups of coffee before making any big decisions. So, as the Titanic was speeding along, minding her own business, she passed the New York and the Oceanic ships. The Titanic decided to make a left turn, but the suction was just too much for the poor New York. She started to drift off towards the Titanic. The Oceanic was leaning so much, her gangplank smacked into the water like a belly flop in the pool. Thankfully, the captain of one of the tugboats was there to save the day. He used his trusty megaphone to call the Vulcan to the port side of the Titanic to pick up some crew members. He then noticed the New York in trouble and acted quickly, throwing a line to slow her down. The Titanic's captain was probably scratching his head, wondering how to handle these big ships like the Titanic. That's because he'd only recently experienced sailing on larger ships. Close one, right? Well, it was just part of the story. As it turns out, the huge list of misfortunes might have started even earlier. Another theory suggests that during the ship's construction days in Northern Ireland, a fire broke out in the coal bunkers. Talk about a rocky start. If this information is correct, then the ship's hull may have been affected by the incident before it even set sail. Fans of this theory argue that a fire popped up inside one of the Titanic's large coal bunkers and really damaged an important segment of the ship's hull. Some claim there's even photographic evidence to back this up. A bunch of photos documenting how the ship was made and pampered for its maiden voyage were found, and they showed a significant black streak on the outside of the Titanic's hull. Weirdly enough, the streak was really close to where the iceberg hit during that cold April. Now I know what you're thinking. This theory might sound far-fetched, but most of these people have been gathering information about the Titanic for decades, and they're convinced that this is the real deal. They even believe that the fire started way earlier than the day the Titanic set out on its maiden voyage, particularly about 3 weeks prior. Why was this overlooked? Well, because of fear of bad press, mostly. Also, because of all the fuss created around the unsinkable ship, it was important that they stuck to the initial calendar. Of course, not everyone is convinced by this new theory. Some people think it's just another wacky idea to add to the long list of Titanic sensational theories. What if I told you there were even rumors about part of an ancient Egyptian coffin being on board? Could that have had something to do with the disastrous ending of the Titanic? Some truly believe it did. Let me tell you the story about the unlucky mummy. It's a tale that'll give you goosebumps. Back in the 19th century, this ancient Egyptian artifact, a mummy case lid to be exact, was brought over to Europe. And as soon as it arrived, strange things started happening. Now, some of the stories may be a bit exaggerated, but according to journalists, some of them were actually true. The rumors sparked the interest of a British writer who later spent months investigating the mummy case and its alleged related stories. He was planning to write an article debunking the myths, but he found out they were all too real. Unfortunately, he never got to finish his work because he passed away suddenly. Others believed that the mummy case was guarded by Egyptian elementals. They warned others not to mess with the artifact. The mummy case's history is just as spooky. It was found in Egypt and sold to a certain someone conveniently named Mr. W at a party organized by a well-known English lady. When the mummy case arrived in England, it was given to Mr. W's sister, who immediately suffered from financial losses and other troubles. A photographer who took a picture of the case claimed that he captured a living woman's face on the film. The mummy case eventually ended up in the British Museum, and it's still there today. However, rumors say that it was aboard the Titanic and was responsible for its sinking. But don't believe everything you hear. Some sources claim the mummy case never left the British Museum, and the rumor was started by a journalist named William Stead. He was actually a passenger on the Titanic, and he supposedly told his fellow passengers about the ill-fated mummy before the ship went down. Is that what happens when you tempt fate? Seriously doubt it, but it does make you wonder, doesn't it? It gets even weirder, trust me. About 50 passengers got cold feet before the ship took off, and they refused to board the Titanic at the last minute, even if it meant that they'd lose the cost of the ticket. They just had an extremely bad feeling about the whole deal, and even an Irish astrologer warned against making the voyage on the Titanic. I doubt he saw a big ol' iceberg hidden somewhere in the stars, but it does add up to the mystique surrounding the Titanic. And do you know what's even worse? The fact that the ship's binoculars, which could have helped prevent the iceberg collision, were locked up. Apparently, those binoculars could have been used by lookouts on that fateful night. But guess what? The key was held by David Blair, an officer who was sadly bumped from the crew before the ship's departure. Poor guy. He probably didn't even know what he was holding on to. Now, some historians think that if those binoculars were in use, the iceberg might have been spotted earlier. But hey, let's not point fingers here. Others argue that it wouldn't have made a difference. Who knows? Maybe the lookout was too busy looking at the stars to notice a giant iceberg in front of them. But seriously, what were they thinking? Locking up the binoculars on a ship that big is like forgetting to pack sunscreen for a trip to the beach. Also, the ship might have been going a bit too fast. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why was the captain in such a hurry? Well, apparently, good old Captain Smith was trying to beat his ship's older sibling, the Olympic, in a race to see which ship could cross the Atlantic faster. I guess he had a bit of a sibling rivalry going on or something. But here's the thing. Even though there were warnings about icebergs in the area, the Titanic just kept on chugging along at full speed ahead. I mean, come on, guys, it's not rocket science. If you know there are icebergs around, maybe slow down a little bit, right? And then, close to midnight on April 14th, 1912, the Titanic hit that iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. It also famously had a mere 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsible dinghies on board. No wonder it ended up being one of the worst maritime disasters in modern history. After the whole event, people started believing in life beyond the veil and contacted mediums, hoping for signs from the ones they had lost at sea. Can't say I blame them, though there's no verified story of someone managing to contact a Titanic passenger from the beyond, though.
Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, but not many people know that Titanic had 2 sister ships, and that on the night of its sinking, one of them was rushing to help but didn't make it in time. Bad luck seemed to follow the trio of ships, but each one of them had glorious moments that live in the minds of those who sailed in them. Keep on watching, to discover a story of awe, ingenuity, and ill fate. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn notifications on to join us on the bright side of life. You know how the iceberg hit the Titanic, how the band played to the end, and how the whole tragedy unfolded, but before it happened, it would have seemed an impossibility for such a ship to meet the end it did. None of that could have been foreseen by White Star Line, the company who built the Titanic, who had high hopes for what the unsinkable ship and its sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic, would accomplish. The Olympic was the first of the trio to make sail on June 11, 1911, heading towards New York. The sheer size of it would wow the crowds. The Olympic's maiden voyage went without incident, and a crowd of 8,000 people in New York got to explore its luxurious accommodations while it was docked there. There were high expectations for the massive ship, but just around 2 months later, the Olympic crashed with the HMS Hawke. The Hawke got the brunt of the damage, as the bow was left flat as a pancake. After the crash, the Olympic made its way slowly back to Belfast, where the Titanic was being constructed. On the dock, people could see the two enormous ships side by side, as parts of the Titanic were used to put the Olympic back in shape. A rare sight to behold. And on April 14, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg, and minutes later, the crew radioed nearby ships for help. That night, the Olympic was returning from New York when it received the distress signal. The ship turned around and rushed at full speed towards the Titanic, but they were so far away that they would have arrived next night. At some point during the early hours of April 15, 1912, the crew of the Olympic decided they wouldn't make it in time and stopped course. The survivors of the Titanic were eventually rescued by the Carpathia. Olympic was set up with lifeboats for all crew and passengers after the Titanic sank. It went from having 20 lifeboats to 64. Changes were also made to the watertight bulkheads, and an extra hull to construct a type of double hull was installed. It was determined that a double hull would have kept the Titanic from sinking. For several years, Olympic was used in the war effort against Germany. Throughout the years, Olympic carried over 200,000 passengers, which included thousands of Americans fleeing from Europe and troops battling during World War I. One of the most significant moments for this ship was when it struck a German submarine and sank it. It was discovered that the submarine was preparing to fire a torpedo on the Olympic before Olympic rammed it. The Olympic ended up sailing the seas for 3 decades, which earned her the nickname of the Old Reliable, despite some previous accidents. It went on to help the survivors on the HMS Audacious when it was sinking, and do what it couldn't for its sister, Titanic. Eventually, bad luck caught up with the Olympic. The ship crashed with the Nantucket Lightship, and the crash signaled the beginning of the end. Beaten up, and after years of service, the Olympic was demolished and scrapped for parts. The Old Reliable saw many years of service and thousands of passengers, but the Britannic's journey was shorter-lived. When the Titanic sank, White Star Line was faced with a problem since they already had another enormous ship in the works. White Star Line began construction on the HMHS Britannic on November 30th, 1911, around 4 months before the Titanic sank. Although the Britannic was the youngest of the trio of ships, having been constructed last, it was also the biggest. They intended to name it Gigantic, but after the Titanic's disaster, they changed the name to Britannic, since they considered it to be a lucky name. With the Titanic sinking, the White Star Line underwent rigorous investigation, and many changes were made to the Britannic's design. The Britannic looked very similar to the Titanic, and it had what was at the time the largest marine turbine in the world, able to reach faster speeds than the Olympic. With Titanic's fate fresh in their minds, everything possible was done to ensure the safety of this newer ship. The Britannic was eventually launched on February 26, 1914, almost 2 years after Titanic met its end. After the Titanic's disaster, the White Star Line wanted the Britannic to redeem their name. The Britannic was on its way to becoming a successful ship. It transported passengers for over a year and a half when the British government requisitioned it and turned it into a hospital ship during the beginning of World War I. The ship became an even more impressive sight to look at. It was painted all white, with enormous red crosses on its side to indicate it was a hospital ship. One of the ship's surgeons, Dr. J.T.H. Beaumont, thought of it as the most wonderful hospital ship that ever sailed the seas. It could treat as many as 3,309 patients at once. This is how the Britannic became His Majesty's hospital ship, or HMHS Britannic. Though the sight of this magnificent ship must have put a smile on a wounded soldier's face or two, the Britannic didn't operate for long. Just a year after it was turned into a hospital ship, the Britannic was making its way through the Aegean Sea to pick up wounded soldiers, when it was struck by a loud explosion. The passengers didn't know what had happened, but headed to the deck to disembark. It is unclear what hit the Britannic, but the general consensus is that it was struck by a mine left by a German U-boat, though some still believe a torpedo hit it. The captain tried to move the ship to a beach close by, but the ship was sinking fast. In the desperation, against the captain's orders, several crew members launched lifeboats and disembarked. But since the ship was moving and the propellers working, the lifeboats were sucked and destroyed by the propellers. Though so much effort had gone in to ensure the Britannic was safer than the Titanic, whatever explosion occurred left the Britannic in the same dire condition as the Titanic in just 10 minutes. In a cruel twist of fate, it also sank in the ocean. Unlike Titanic's enormous death toll, only 30 people perished in the sinking of the Britannic, and over 1,000 survived. So many people survived because the accident happened in the morning, when the temperature of the water was warmer and the Greek island Kea was close by to offer help. In the end, the Britannic only sailed the seas for over 2.5 years. The bad luck that followed the Titanic and the Britannic and the accidents and demise of the Olympic was remarkable. But what was most impressive is that there was a woman who sailed on all 3 ships and survived. Violet Jessop was a crew member and nurse aboard the ships. She was there when the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawk in 1911 and disembarked safely. 2 years later, she escaped the sinking of the Titanic in lifeboat number 16, and she showed some women it was safe to board the lifeboats. You'd imagine that would be enough to keep her from ever getting on a boat again, but not for her. A few years later, she served as a nurse in the Britannic while it was used as a hospital ship. When the explosion occurred, Violet jumped overboard, was pulled under by the water, and hit her head on the keel but survived. Can you imagine her experience? She must have had nerves of steel. All in all, the trio of ships saw journeys of triumph and tragedy. Ill fate might have followed them, but all the survivors were left with incredible stories to tell. So tell us, Brightsiders, would you have liked to have seen any of these ships in real life? Let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to give this video a like, share it with your friends, and click subscribe to stay on the bright side. "I'll never let go, Jack. I'll never let go," said Rose. Then she did let go, and the whole movie theater burst into tears. It happened when Titanic came out in 1997. Alright, who am I kidding? It's really hard not to cry when you watch this scene for the 10th, 20th, and 50th time almost 30 years later. But did this great love story happen in real life? Or did James Cameron just invent it for some good drama? As much as I don't want to disappoint you, Jack and Rose never fell in love on board the real Titanic. There was a real Jay Dawson on the luxurious ocean liner, but he was a crew member, and his full name was Joseph. The real-life inspiration for Rose was the American artist Beatrice Wood. James Cameron came across her biography while he was working on the first draft of the script and decided to bring her love for art and family background into the story. It doesn't mean that the movie is completely off when it comes to historical accuracy, though. The unsinkable ship that sank departed from Southampton, England to New York and was 400 miles south of Newfoundland on April 14th when crew members noticed the iceberg. The contact with it lasted 37 seconds, precisely as long as the corresponding scene in the movie. Remember this guy, Thomas Andrews, who was wandering around with a small notebook and pencil? He was the real ship designer. Andrews was quite talented at what he did and had worked on many successful projects before the Titanic. He would normally travel on the ships he designed during the maiden voyage to make sure everything was going smoothly. He boarded the Titanic as one of the first-class passengers and was taking notes all the time. After the unfortunate rendezvous with an iceberg, Andrews was seen inspecting the flooded parts of the ship with Captain Smith. According to his sad forecast, the Titanic would have gone down in about 2 hours. One of the stewards claimed that he had seen Thomas Andrews moments before the sinking. He chose not to leave the Titanic and didn't put on his life belt. No one had seen him ever since. Another memorable moment from the movie is a boy playing on one of the decks with his spinning top. This was an accurate recreation of a real photo that was taken on board the Titanic on April 11, 1912. The passengers in the photo are first-class passengers Frederick Spedden and his 6-year-old son Douglas. The family was going back home to America after traveling around Algeria. When the evacuation of passengers began, Spedden's nurse told him they were going to see the stars. They say he had successfully slept through the entire drama and woke up safe and sound in a lifeboat the following morning. His father had also survived the sinking. Sadly, an automobile accident took the life of Douglas just 3 years later. One of Titanic's most charismatic ladies, both on the screen and in real life, got her nickname Unsinkable Molly Brown for a good reason. Several witnesses remembered she was, indeed, trying to persuade others in her lifeboat to go back and save more lives, just like in that heartbreaking scene from the movie. When Carpathia came to the rescue of the surviving Titanic passengers, Margaret Brown was helping lower-class survivors and involved her fellow first-class passengers in the process. Once they all got on solid ground, Brown organized a survivors committee. She awarded the captain of the Carpathia for rescuing so many people and was really upset she hadn't been allowed to testify at the Titanic hearings because she was a woman. You won't see any fumes above the fourth pipe of the ship in the movie. It's not a technical mistake. The Titanic, indeed, had it only for more impressive looks and didn't really need that pipe. Back in 1911, the year before our hero's departure, large ships would mostly sail with 4 chimneys. They needed those to draw heat and fumes from their massive boilers. The Titanic was a real engineering gem that only needed 3 chimneys to function. So the 4th was added for balance. They thought the public would have been disappointed to only see 3 pipes on the greatest ship of all time. The movie had an impressive budget, $200 million, but even that wasn't enough to cover all the possible costs. Cameron knew they had to save some money, so they built the replica of the liner only on the starboard, which means the right side. They chose this side to make things look more realistic. The wind at the filming location was moving mostly from north to south, so with the fumes going out, it looked like the liner was actually moving through the ocean. But if you remember one of the first scenes with the Titanic departing from Southampton and people waving, you'll understand why the crew had a problem with it. The real ship was docked at the port, or left side, there. They found a brilliant solution and just flipped the scene horizontally to make it look real. The letters and buttons on costumes were reversed, and actors walked in the opposite direction for everything to be changed in post-production. One of the scenes I can't watch without tears is the elderly couple holding on to each other as they go down with the Titanic. The couple who inspired this heartbreaking episode were real people, some of the richest passengers of the not-so-unsinkable ship. They were Isidore and Ida Strauss, and they owned Macy's. When news of the disaster spread, they put on life jackets and ran to the decks along with others. Ida stepped onto the lifeboat, but Isidore refused to do so before all the ladies and little ones were there. Ida didn't want to leave her husband. She climbed out of the lifeboat and handed her mink coat to her maid, saying she would no longer need it. Isidore wrapped his arms around Ida, and they remained on the bridge of the ship until a huge wave swept them both into the sea. So the bed scene wasn't that accurate, and James Cameron later admitted he had taken some license as a director. You know this guy who was drinking from a flask next to the main characters as the ship was going down? His name was Charles Jugan from England, and he was in charge of 10 bakers, 2 confectioners, and a Vienna baker aboard. He was expecting to earn a real lump sum and would have been one of the best-paid crew members if everything had gone well. The night the iceberg hit, Johan was off duty, taking a rest in his bunk. He immediately woke up and sent his bakers to deliver bread to lifeboats. He then returned to his room for a drink. Once he came back on the deck, he helped others get in his assigned lifeboat. There was no more room for Charles inside, so he ended up on the outside of the rails of the ship. Finally, when the Titanic submerged, he just swam away, and as the sun rose again, he found one of the lifeboats and was rescued by Carpathia. The contents of the flask must have helped him survive. The well-dressed man who decided to stay on the Titanic forever was American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim. That last name probably sounds familiar. And yes, he was from that famous family. Guggenheim was traveling with his valet, his significant other, a singer from France called Leontine, her maid, and their chauffeur. They all boarded the Titanic in France during one of the short stops it made after leaving Southampton. When disaster struck, Benjamin was helping the ladies get in their lifeboat. He reportedly said they were only saying goodbye till the next day. He was sure the ship would be quickly repaired. After helping many women and youngsters get in the boats, Guggenheim chose not to fight over the remaining seats. He and his valet returned from the decks to their first-class suite and put on their finest suits to go down like gentlemen.
There were no binoculars on board the famous Titanic on the night when they were needed the most. The lookouts were blind, helpless, and doomed, and the ship went down, taking hundreds of lives, right? Well, it's just one of the many myths from a whole ocean of half-truths, rumors, and dramatic retellings the Titanic is still sailing in. There were binoculars on board. The real issue was access. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet in the crow's nest, which is the lookout point, but the key went missing. A crew member named David Blair, who was supposed to be on the Titanic, was reassigned to a different ship at the last minute. He forgot to leave the key behind. The key to saving hundreds of lives, literally, was sitting in his pocket far away as the Titanic was going down. But we'll never find out what would have happened if the key had been there. The sky was clear that night, but there wasn't a moon to light the way, and there was no wind, so the sea was glassy, and there were no ripples, which are the usual warning signs of icebergs floating around. Then there's the idea that the Titanic was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, but historians disagree. The Titanic's crew knew there was ice out there, but instead of slowing down, they just kept going, cruising around 22 knots. That's only a couple of knots slower than her top speed, but the Titanic wasn't being pushed to her limits. Many of her furnaces weren't even fully stoked.
And it was normal practice for that time to just keep going and trust those on the lookout to spot the ice before the ship hits it. Those massive Atlantic liners weren't about taking it easy. They were about being perfectly on time. Ships like the Titanic were basically the express trains of the sea, and any delay would have been a PR disaster. So, yeah, they knew the risks, but didn't think it was a big deal. After all, plenty of ships had close calls before and came out okay. They didn't see ice as a huge threat those days, and weren't even afraid of head-on collisions. And have you heard that the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, marketed it as unsinkable? In 1910, the company was hyping up their two new ocean giants, the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. Their ads proudly declared these ships were designed to be unsinkable. What the company meant by it was that, on paper, the design should keep them afloat. Later on, they even had to clarify that they never promised the ships were actually unsinkable. By 1911, before the Titanic even hit the water, magazines were already running wild with the idea. Writers were calling her practically unsinkable, pointing to her fancy new watertight compartments as proof. And just like that, a legend was born before the ship even left the dock. After she went down, even one of White Star Line's own executives admitted during the official inquiry that when he first heard the news, he didn't believe it. He genuinely believed the Titanic couldn't sink. But that whole unsinkable thing was never the main selling point. White Star Line wasn't really pushing safety, but selling luxury. The Titanic was supposed to be the crown jewel of ocean travel, massive, elegant, and dripping in comfort. Another story that just stuck with us is that before the iceberg even struck, a coal fire was burning away in one of the Titanic's bunkers. It weakened the ship's hull and made it more vulnerable. Some people even say that fire caused or accelerated the sinking. Well, it's partially true. There was a coal fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers before the voyage. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unusual in steamships of the time. They could smolder for days. But it was nothing like a fire that would be raging uncontrollably. Historical timelines, crew logs, and structural analysis all indicate that a fire of such intensity and in such a position couldn't have caused fatal structural damage. If the fire had done that much harm, the ship might have failed even before the collision. But the Titanic stayed afloat for over 2 hours, which means the real villain was still the iceberg. Another twist to the fire story is that it could have distracted the crew, preventing them from dealing with the iceberg situation properly. That sounds more plausible, but still, that's not the same as saying the fire was the real culprit. Speaking of the real culprits, there's no doubt it was an iceberg, but the scale of disaster it caused was way more subtle than a big movie-style gash in the hull. Instead, it produced many tiny fractures in the ship's rivets, seams, and metal joints. Each fracture was almost unnoticeable, but because the ship was cruising, the water was steadily running through those micro gaps under pressure. It slowly seeped into multiple compartments and filled 6 of the watertight sections. The Titanic lingered, hovered, took on water, and was failing compartment after compartment. She sank over a period of 2 hours, rather than going down in minutes. If the iceberg had catastrophically torn open the hull, the ship would have gone down almost immediately, and people would have had no time to react and escape. Sadly, not all of them had that chance anyway. You probably recall the heartbreaking scene from the Titanic movie, where third-class passengers attempt to escape to the decks, but they are locked below in their section. Well, it's only partially true. Yes, there were barriers separating passenger classes, but they were mostly in place to comply with U.S. immigration laws. Third-class passengers going to America in search of a new life had to pass health checks and immigration processing. That's why they were traveling on separate decks. There were some lifeboats for them, although not in the third-class sections of the ship, so they would have to navigate a maze of corridors and stairs to reach the top. And many of the third-class passengers didn't even want to try, as they didn't want to leave their luggage behind. In the end, only about a quarter of the third-class passengers survived, but no one forcefully kept them on the lower decks. Now let's switch gears and discuss the Titanic facts that people used to deny or overlook, but which have since been proven true. For example, most deck plans and diagrams you've seen in Titanic documentaries don't show a hidden deck down under the waterline called the inner bottom. Many outside engineers did not fully understand or discuss it. This hidden deck stretched nearly the full length of the ship and had 44 separate watertight tanks. Most of them were for water ballast, some for fresh water. There were also wing tanks, port and starboard, which helped with balance. The inner bottom was like the ship's built-in organizer. It divided the Titanic into separate sections, allowing different parts to remain balanced and easier to control. It was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the forward compartments flooded. Sadly, the rendezvous with the iceberg opened 6 compartments, and you know what happened next. And finally, my personal favorite Titanic myth is that the ship split cleanly in half, like some Hollywood action scene. Blame James Cameron for that one. We all cried when we saw it, but reality was way uglier. For many years after the tragedy, survivors couldn't all agree on what they saw. Some said the ship went down whole. Others swore it broke apart. No one believed the second group until the scientists found the wreck in 1985. Then, they finally confirmed the truth that the Titanic had indeed broken in two, but not neatly. The metal twisted, tore, and shredded as the stern lifted into the air, and 2 opposite forces ripped it apart. And to make it even more tragic, the people were still clinging to the back half when it snapped and plunged into darkness.
Exclusive photographs, by far the best yet, are in from the Titanic. For most of this century, that...
When the first images of the Titanic shipwreck appeared in September 1985, the world stopped. People were glued to their TVs, watching the legendary ship reappear after more than 70 years. Where did the Titanic sink, you ask? It's located about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. This so-called unsinkable ship rests in complete darkness, about 12,600 feet below the surface. Yep, that's how deep the Titanic is. But even after such a long fall down to the ocean floor, the front part, known as the bow, still looks surprisingly intact. I mean, the railings were still there, the anchor chains too, even the elegant curves of the hull you might recognize from old photos. But the news barely mentioned the stern back then. And there's a reason we still don't talk much about it. You see, these images were about more than just capturing mesmerizing and eerie footage. They were proof of what really happened when the Titanic sank. We were finally getting some answers about this 1912 disaster, when more than 1,600 people lost their lives. And before you Google how many people survived the Titanic, I'll tell you, 706. Among those survivors, several claimed they saw the ship break apart as it went down. Others insisted it sank in one piece, and in the end, investigators agreed with them. Back then, official reports concluded that Titanic had gone down intact. So, for 73 years, that was the official story, until we finally saw the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean. When the Titanic underwater photos were released, they confirmed it. Yes, the liner really did break apart as it sank. And if we've just seen those images of the bow, that means the stern must be around there too, right? Well, kind of. I mean, we did find it. It's located about 2,000 feet away from the bow, lying on the ocean floor. So yes, it exists. But why doesn't anyone ever talk about what happened to the stern of the Titanic? Well, there's a big reason for that. See, the bow, even after all the damage from hitting the seafloor, still looks recognizable. Many of its interiors are surprisingly well preserved, and it's lying as if the ship was continuing its voyage. But the stern is destroyed. Today it's more like a twisted tangle of steel that barely looks like a ship at all. Only the parts that are more resilient, like the propellers, reciprocating engines, and rudder, have managed to hold their shape. But the rest of the stern section is melting into the seafloor. Yet, to understand why it's in such a terrible state, we need to go back to that freezing night of April 15, 1912, the night of the Titanic wreck. Just hours before the tragedy, Titanic was still sailing smoothly across the cold North Atlantic. The stern was alive with people, families talking, music playing, life going on as usual. This is where the room for passengers with the cheapest tickets were located. That's why third-class travelers were also known as steerage passengers. But the stern wasn't only for passengers. It also contained many of the ship's storage areas, including cargo holds, baggage rooms, kitchens, crew quarters, and even the engineering spaces. And hold on to that info, it's going to be important in a second. So let's jump straight to when the liner struck the iceberg. As the bow began to sink, the stern slowly lifted out of the water, putting enormous strain on the middle of the ship. By around 2 in the morning, the lights on Titanic flickered and then went out. Moments later, the ship broke in two, and the bow disappeared beneath the waves. The stern briefly settled back on the water before rising again, this time almost vertical. It stayed upright for a few seconds and then began its final plunge. At about 2:20 in the morning, the stern vanished beneath the Atlantic. Titanic was gone. What was happening beneath the water were two completely different scenarios. First, the bow slowly filled with water and began to drift downward, almost sailing gently like a submarine. Because of that, it managed to keep its shape and stayed mostly intact. But Titanic's stern collapse was a whole different story. The stern was ripped wide open where the ship had split apart. Water rushed in through that open end at incredible speed. This sudden flooding made the stern plunge downward much faster than the bow. The rush of water created so much turbulence that pieces were ripped off and scattered all around the ocean floor. Now, remember what I said earlier about the spaces inside the stern? Those huge storage areas were wide open, and many of them contained air pockets. So when the stern section broke away, it still had compartments filled with trapped air. As it spun down into the depths, this increasing water pressure crushed those pockets one by one. The surrounding structure began to implode, scattering pieces of metal, furniture, statues, and passengers' belongings across the ocean floor. So many experts believe the immense water pressure made that section collapse as it sank, and that's why we can't see much of it today. And now you know the answer to the Titanic back section mystery. We don't talk about it much, simply because there's not much left to see. It's like the part of the Titanic story that's too broken or too painful to talk about openly. The side of the ship that truly feels lost. And sorry to say this, but that's the future of the bow, too. I mean, it won't be there forever. The iconic shape of the wreck is changing year after year, and not in a good way. The front part of the Titanic is deteriorating, and one day it'll be entirely gone. Down on the seabed, the Titanic faces enormous pressure, nearly 390 times greater than at the surface. The good news is there aren't any air pockets left inside the ship, so big implosions won't happen again. But the bad news is that the ship's own weight is now helping to tear it apart. As those 52,000 tons of steel slowly settle into the ocean floor, they twist and pull on the hull. Submersible missions have already spotted large cracks running through the steel plates, and even the decks themselves are starting to cave in. And there's something else. The wreck might look cool and spooky today, but that actually comes from a thick layer of bacteria and microbes covering it. The problem is, they're slowly eating the Titanic. Yep, most of the corrosion happening down there is caused by bacteria, and this is gradually weakening the entire structure. Steel plates, beams, and supports are getting thinner every year. Scientists estimate that the ship is losing between 0.13 and 0.2 tons of iron every single day. Still, even at that rate, the wreck won't vanish overnight. Experts believe it could take up to 420 years for the liner to disappear completely. Until then, we'll keep watching this sad but natural process unfold. Parts of the ship have been falling apart little by little since the night when Titanic sank, and a lot has already changed since we started taking underwater photos, like the railing sections that have dropped and the ceiling in the captain's bathroom that's collapsed. That's why so many expeditions are now focused on capturing footage and detailed scans of the Titanic shipwreck to preserve its memory before the ocean takes it all. It's our way of keeping the story alive, even as time and nature continue their quiet work. Maybe those hungry bacteria can take a break from their buffet, so that Titanic can rest in peace with many more years to come.